First, I have to say I was so heartened to hear Carl refer to the significance of the events in Salem and to realize he was not talking about 1692. Some of you probably know the Boston architect David Lee of Stull and Lee, talking about the era in which Ada Louise wrote her Salem stories. David has observed, the 60s really happened in the 70s. Partly, I think he's talking about the way our memories tend to conflate things. Partly, he's talking about the fact that the 60s is a really useful handle for referring to a complicated cultural moment. But mostly, I think he's speaking with the perspective of an architect. It can take a long time for an idea to become reality. The most powerful ideas often develop their momentum from a variety of influences. They draw upon their context. I'd like to talk this afternoon about the context of what happened here in Salem. Because in Salem, the 60s really did happen in the 70s. So why are we starting with an image of Country Joe McDonald? Because all the photos we see of Ada Louise from that period, we see her in an aura, a kind of Mad Men corporate cool. It comes from Ada Louise's own native elegance, which she had all her life, against the backdrop of the influence that she had in corporate and institutional worlds. So it's sometimes easy to forget how mixed up crazy that time really was. And strangely enough, Ada Louise actually had something in common with Country Joe, beyond the fact they both had double-barreled names. In 1965, they both wrote significant pieces that were calls to action, but they wouldn't know for another 4 years that the public had really been listening. A quick look at the headlines in the Boston Globe and the New York Times for October 13, 1965, the day of her landmark story about Salem, shows some of the tensions the country was facing in headlines that unfortunately are not really very different than a lot of the stories that are running in newspapers today. One of those headlines actually gives us some insight into what was happening in Salem. The Kitty Genovese murder had happened just 18 months earlier and was still fresh in people's mind with its horrific story of a young woman screaming for help while her neighbors did nothing. It was a terrible story, but one that quickly reached almost mythic proportions because it fed into something deep in the American psyche, a fear and distrust of cities as unhealthy, scary places that needed to be cleaned up. This fear of cities goes way back and certainly finds a home in a lot of 19th century literature. But for many middle and upper class people sipping tea in comfortable parlors, it was Jacob Riis, a police reporter using the relatively new medium of flash photography, who captured the lives of both the destitute and the criminal, as in this famous 1888 image, Bandit's Roost. Riis was a social reformer, and he used his images to advocate for better housing and services for the poor. In the 1930s, of course, the federal government was forced to pay attention. FDR's New Deal introduced slum clearance to the federal toolkit, along with low-cost housing. In the 1950s, the feds stepped up their game, providing funding for acquiring and clearing blight under a new banner, Urban Renewal. One of the most notorious examples, of course, is Boston's own West End, shown here in 1959 after the demolition of 46 acres, an area similar in scale to Salem's downtown renewal area. But slum clearances weren't enough to destroy the cities. The feds also had to throw in highway funding, accelerating the post-war rush to the suburbs. For Salem, this is when things really started to get personal. Construction of Route 128, which happened in segments, started to accelerate around 1950. This is 128 in Danvers, when it still looks like a pretty nice bike path. But the death knell for Salem's downtown retail district came in 1958 with the opening of the North Shore Shopping Center, at that time an open-air mall with a bowling alley, movie theater, and even an amusement park called Kittytown. And just to be sure that the city would really struggle, around the same time, Salem embarked on its own version of a big dig, burying the rail line in a tunnel under Washington Street, completely messing up access to downtown shops and services. By 1962, the city was desperate, really worried. Its previously healthy tax base had fallen through the floor. 3 national chains closed their Salem stores. A survey in the early 60s showed 71,000 square feet of vacant retail space and 96,000 square feet of vacant office space. The mayor, Francis Collins, established the Salem Redevelopment Authority to take on the challenge, and almost immediately the SRA hired a consultant to develop a Planning Services Group of Cambridge. I'd like to quickly show you some images. Most of these were photos taken between 1973, but they'll give you a sense of the enormity of the problem. And I have to say, as I went through these and some others, I started to feel almost a strange kind of sympathy for these guys. Their responsibility was enormous, and at some level, they must have been terrified. Even the bars were closing. To oversimplify it, they saw that they had 2 problems: the tax base and cars. And in their minds, the answer could only be new buildings, wide new roads, and parking. Lots of parking. Here are some scenes from Essex Street. You'll notice the unmistakable facade of a Woolworth store on the right, but even the 5 and 10 had cleared out of town. Newmark's finer apparel, accessories, and gifts were also only a memory. In addition to the problem of vacancies and a declining tax base, Salem was also struggling with social issues. 600 people were on the waiting list for senior citizen housing. A quarter of the residents were on fixed income, and some statistics show that the median income for the city was lower than Roxbury. And then there was Old Town Hall, surrounded by vacant and boarded up buildings, and left sitting in the middle of a parking lot. So here's a plan that had Ada Louise and not a few residents so upset. Let me give you some landmarks here for orientation. It says north up. Here's Old Town Hall, East India Marine Hall, St. Peter's is here, and the Charter Street Cemetery, the old burying point, is here. And you'll see Essex Street, Washington, and Hawthorne Boulevard. The famous Loop Road clipped off the Oriental Garden, as Dan Monroe referred to earlier. That would have been right through there. A site that even at that time, the trustees of the museum were thinking someday might be the site of some expansion, even though at that time there was some notion of expanding to the east. You can immediately distinguish on this map the difference between the old buildings and the new buildings. Just look at the scale, the huge scale of the new buildings. And you'll also notice that the idea of a pedestrian mall was already in place. Pedestrian malls were all the rage back then, following the recent completion of a successful mall project in Rotterdam, Holland. The diagram on the left gives you a conceptual sense of what they were thinking. I've laid it next to Google Maps to help you with some orientation, but once again, here's St. Peter's and the old town hall down there. It's important to realize that this plan was part of a promised connector road, a major highway connecting the city to 128 that in its last version would have followed an old rail line through Peabody, a city that was not too happy about that. The connector road did not finally die until 1982, and until then it was a little like a sacred text repeated among devout believers. All will be well when the connector is here. The SRA released a model of its plan just a few months after Ada Louise's story. By then, the museum had negotiated to get its garden back, but the basic concept was the same. And once again, here's East India and St. Peter's, with St. Peter's Street now continuing south toward the burying ground. Here's Town Hall again. You'll notice that what is now the bookstore has been demolished. Of 177 buildings in the district, only 39 would have been left standing. Of 113 buildings considered worthy of preservation by an historic district study committee, only 12 would remain. Here's St. Peter's and the Tabernacle Church at the top. This plan had many sins, most unforgivable of which was wiping out centuries of heritage. But I'd say it's also possible to argue that the plan's equally unforgivable crime was its complete incoherence. And finally, a bad slide, but one that will give you a good sense of what they were planning for a poor old town hall. Parking garages on either side. Did they have a choice? Can you say, well, you know, that's really what everyone was doing back then. That's what they were all thinking back then? No, they did have a choice. Of course they had a choice. Already, smart people were pushing back against the very idea of urban renewal, and many had already been exploring alternatives for historic districts. The demolition of Penn Station in New York in 1963 had energized the preservation crowd. By 1965, plans were underway for the rehab of Lewis Wharf on Boston's waterfront, and Ben Thompson was already studying Quincy Market and Faneuil Hall, although he wouldn't be the designated architect until 1969. New Bedford, Newport, and Annapolis were all well on their way to other approaches. And mirroring anti-war protesters, citizens groups were getting noisier. Power was starting to devolve to the people. But on top of all that, the SRA was astoundingly bullheaded. By the late 60s, the SRA was acquiring and clearing sites, even if it had no immediate use or designated developer in hand. The irony, of course, was that many of these businesses were just trying to hang on, and they got caught, as in the case of the pet shop, which you can see here with the signs in their windows, "We are moving," and they make it clear why. Because of urban renewal, they got pushed out to Route 114, of all places. As people began to see the actual devastation and the fact that there was a complete failure to replace anything, they became increasingly upset. A fixture at every preservation discussion at the time, in every town and in every city, was a character called the little old lady in tennis shoes, a term that managed to be both sexist and ageist. There were enough of them that they even managed to have their own acronym, the Lolits. Salem certainly had its share, but perhaps best known was Bessie Monroe, whose house on Ash Street was scheduled for demolition. Well into her 80s and in ill health, she simply refused to move. The SRA eventually decided to back down, figuring they'd let her live out her days before tearing down her house. But little did they know that their own time was at hand. After a variety of legal and political attempts to stop the SRA, all in vain, in 1969, opponents decided to go after the big guy, and they managed to topple Mayor Francis Collins in an election. He was succeeded by Sam Zoll, shown here in a much later photo. In the year of the election, 1969, 56 buildings were demolished, with some of their historic fragments going to Newport for restoration projects there. And despite the cleared land, there was still no developer interest. Zoll had vowed to shake up the SRA, and his first year was filled with tension. By 1971, 3 years after demolition had begun, there was still no developer interest. Zoll took action. He appointed Tim Noonan as SRA chair and Bill Tinty as vice chair, and within 2 years, he had replaced the entire board. The planning consultants were also immediately booted and replaced by Bob Kerr, a brilliant preservation planner who had worked in Newport, New Bedford, and Annapolis, shown here in recent photos. John Emerson, a smart and sophisticated young architect, became the SRA's first staff architect, producing design and redevelopment guidelines for each of the buildings to be restored. I think they are the two unsung heroes of this project. The city would not look the same today without them. Sadly, Bob died in 1974 at the age of only 45, and we just lost John Emerson this last year. But there was another influence on the future of Salem, Edmund Bacon. I think Salem residents will be shocked to hear that they owe much of the feel of their city today to, guess what, Philadelphia. Within a year after Mayor Zoll's shakeup, developer interest actually started to pour in. Architect Nelson Aldrich, a resident of Marblehead, perhaps best known now for his Bank of Boston building, AKA the Pregnant Building in downtown Boston, assembled a team, including Mondev, at that time a ambitious young development firm from Montreal. Mondev had formed an alliance with Ed Bacon, a rock star in the planning world, who had led the redevelopment of Philadelphia's Society Hill starting way back in 1957. As an aside, Ed Bacon was the father of Kevin Bacon, so those of us who met Ed Bacon and know the famous parlor game can claim 2 degrees of separation from Kevin Bacon. It's hard to know now just how much Ed was a face card for Mondev or how much he was a rainmaker. But a look at Society Hill reveals many of the guiding design principles in Salem. And it's no accident. Hired by the city of Salem because of Ed Bacon's influence was the landscape architect John Collins, a talented and supremely humane designer responsible for much of Society Hill. We owe to John Collins the texture and variety of our streetscape, the rich vegetation, the surprise little gardens. We especially owe to John Collins and to Ed Bacon the aspect that set Salem apart from all the other similar restoration cities of that period, an openness to good contemporary architecture. And I think that aspect may be what ensured that Ada Louise's affection for the city would endure long after the redevelopment work was done. By 1972, things were really on a roll. The new Heritage Plaza East Urban Renewal Plan was formally approved by the city. The Salem Corporation, the team with Aldrich and Mondev, was approved as the designated developer for the new City Hall Annex with plans for new shopping mall and parking garage. Construction was underway on the first projects along Front Street with design work on others. It was none too soon. The Liberty Tree Mall in Danvers had just opened, forcing even the North Shore Shopping Center to upgrade and enclose its mall in order to compete. I'll quickly go through some slides that will give you a sense of how much was accomplished over the next 2 years. This is Clark & Friend, a men's clothing shop, and in 1973, the first SRA project to be completed under the direction of John Emerson. The Bowker Block, now the Museum Office Center, reopened as L.H. Rogers, a high-end ladies' dress shop where you could buy Oscar de la Renta, Halston, and Calvin Klein. The Lyceum Restaurant, with restoration and interior design by John Emerson, was Salem's first upscale restaurant and points to one of the cornerstones of Salem's success, working with local businesses that were owner-occupiers of each building. But unquestionably, the key to the success of the renovation program was the use of an innovative idea, the facade easement. In effect, the SRA acquired the first foot or so of a building and paid for $90,000 of the renovation costs, with the owner picking up the difference. It was a bargain. 11 buildings were saved through facade easements, and an additional 16 were rehabbed. This is the Downing Block, later called Lally Shoe Store, restored by Oscar Padjen. The Old Town Hall became the crown jewel of the downtown, restored by architect Jim Ballou. Buildings and public ways were redeveloped to reinforce the character of Derby Square and its new role as a public gathering and performance space. In the background here, you can see the old Lowe's warehouse, which was opened up on the first and ground floors to create more retail and office space. And of course, the Pickman Derby block, once scheduled for demolition to become part of a pedestrian plaza, and since the 1970s, the location of a bookshop with restoration by Jonathan Woodman. The renovation of the old Customs House by Oscar Padjen and John Emerson marked a turning point for the downtown. With apartments on the upper 2 floors, it was the first to provide housing in the downtown, a goal of the new regime under Zoll, Noonan, and Tinty. But Salem's story wasn't just about small businesses. Institutions made significant contributions, and I think they especially should be recognized for introducing a contemporary vocabulary, which has helped to prevent the dreaded Williamsburg syndrome, which Ada Louise so deplored. This is the Dodge Wing by architect Phil Bourne with Tad Stahl. And this is the Salem 5 by Oscar Padjen, which was featured in a book by the National Trust on the integration of new and old, a hot topic then and now. The design maintained the street wall while extending the notion of gardens into a courtyard access for a new community room where we will have our reception later on. And here's a fun fact for you. The landscape architect on this was Ben Gary, but a young designer in his team was Michael van Valkenburg, now an internationally known landscape architect who is the designer of Armory Park and the Axelrod Walkway here in Salem. So here's the city in 1974, just 3 years after Zoll's SRA shakeup. By 1976, the year of the bicentennial and the opening of Quincy Market, the work on the Renewal District was substantially complete. I wish I could say that we all lived happily ever after. But for many of the downtown merchants, it was a long wait, in some cases 4 years, in some cases too long, before the retail centerpiece of the downtown, the East India Square Mall, finally opened in late 1978. The reasons for the delay included politics, finances, and economy, and lengthy design review. But as you can see, the design itself was inherently flawed. The mall opened in 1978 with appealing high-end tenants, but the 70s recession had taken its toll and turnover began almost immediately. The delay meant that many merchants thought that momentum had been lost. Even so, it was clear that Salem was on its way back. Young people and professionals discovered the city and began to renovate houses, sometimes with the help of this wonderful, I have to say, wonderful little guidebook that was published by Historic Salem. The city approved Heritage Plaza West, a plan by Venturi Rauch, which focused on the west side of Washington Street. And construction began that year on Pickering Wharf, both projects extending the success of the downtown into other parts of the city. Downtown residential projects seem to blossom everywhere, as they continue to do today, creating a very different kind of city. Today, the city's relative affordability has attracted new populations, both young and retirees, groups equally attracted to its walkability, its access to Boston, and its rich cultural life. Traditional economic sectors, professionals, and tourism have exploded way beyond what they were in the 70s as the city has continued to expand its economic diversity into other sectors. And of course, the presence of the Peabody Essex Museum cannot be overstated, not only for bringing the city international recognition and new visitors daily, but also for its contribution to the cultural life of this city. I believe that the small city is the future, especially for a generation of young people who long ago managed to get over that old fear of cities, but who are increasingly priced out of major urban centers and who feel that day-to-day life in such places is often simply too much hassle. So here we are, 50 years after Ada Louise's first story, in a city that now celebrates its heritage. Who'da thunk it? Thank you.